Well, thanks so much for having us. I'll go ahead and introduce myself while I'm on the screen, and then I'll go ahead and share the PowerPoint that we've put together for you. So I'm Montana Audubon's Director of Policy and Science, and I'm based out of our Helena office. So Helena year-round, but we do focus on statewide bird conservation. So fortunately, we get to travel around the state, and we actually just got back from Phillips County. So yeah, statewide bird conservation, and I'll let Carmen introduce herself a bit when she talks as well. So we're gonna team talk this, but we'll keep it simple for you, Emily. That will split up about halfway through for the screen share. So hopefully that'll keep it simple. And so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Oh, I think I actually need, can you undisable the screen share for mine, Emily?
Of course, 1 second. Okay.
Okay, I'm not quite seeing if I can do it yet.
We're not seeing your screen yet. What's coming up for you?
It says that it's disabled. The host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Let me go ahead and just make you the host, and we'll see if that works.
Okay. That looks like it'll do it.
Woohoo!
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we're going into share mode here. Present. Whoops. And now I know I need to, can everyone see the full screen and they're not cut off by the video?
We can, yes.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks again for having us and everyone for joining us, because I know the last few months has been a whole story of adjusting rapidly, and I feel like a lot of people have done that, and Carmen has helped our Audubon do that a lot, and so we appreciate everyone's flexibility and kind of powering through to be able to not meet with you in person, but at least share a little bit about the birds. And so what we want to do today is talk a little bit about Montana Audubon, especially for folks that may not be familiar at all, and sort of give you a little bit of a view into one of the lenses that we look at the landscape which of course is birds, and how we connect with birds and people to get some of our work done. And then of course we want to show you some of the really fun pieces, which are the really neat birds that do inhabit the park. And in Montana, I'll always say that we're really, really lucky to have the birds that we do kind of in our backyards and in our wild places. So hopefully you'll get a good smattering of both our organization and the really cool birds at the park. I wish we could all be there. And again, please feel free to ask questions and we'll try and answer them all at the end, and if not, later. So I will get started, and just a quick intro to who Montana Audubon is. And our mission statement, which really for me has been such a great driving force in my work here the last 6.5 years, is to promote the appreciation, knowledge, and conservation of Montana's native birds, other wildlife, and natural ecosystems, and to safeguard biological diversity for current and future generations. It's a super fun mission statement because it's super broad and all-encompassing, and it means we get to work on just about everything, but we usually use a bird-focused lens when we do work on it. A lot of you are more familiar with National Audubon Society, and I like to show people that we are all a big Audubon Society family, but in Montana we are an independent statewide nonprofit, and that's really important for how we can get work done in the state. But what also is so important are the 9 Audubon chapters that we have in the state. It's a really large state. I'm going to talk about that here soon. But the chapters that we have, mostly on the west side of the state, are really, really imperative to how we get work done. And so hopefully you'll see that we're about birds, but also people. We have basically a three-pronged approach to approaching conservation in Montana, and I'll just step through that quickly because some of the history is fun, where we actually came together as an organization to give birds some representation in the public policy realm and kind of say, what issues do birders have? Well, birds can't speak for themselves, so we speak up for clean water, clean habitats, environment, and tons of issues that really do affect the everyday way that we interact with wildlife. We also have a birds and science program, which more and more has become focused on citizen science and how we can involve the public in helping us conserve birds, primarily through observing them, but also then becoming their advocates. And we'll talk a lot more about bird data today. And then we have an education program, and our education program is primarily based out of our Billings Education Center. So we have headquarters in Billings and then in Helena. But I also like to say when it comes to education, you know, everything is adult education as well. When we work in public policy, we're often educating decision makers. And when we do birds and conservation, same thing, we're often trying to actually educate land managers about the importance of the birds. So education is such a backbone to our organization. And like I said, it's a huge state. It's hard to figure out sometimes how and where to focus, but we've always used habitat as the primary sort of division or focus for especially our public policy and science programs. And one of the habitats we've focused on more than any are really the wetlands and riparian areas in the state. I keep saying Montana is huge, but it's super huge. So 94 million acres. We have national parks that are bigger than entire states, Indian reservations that are bigger than states. So it really is a huge landscape. And surprisingly, these wetland and riparian habitats, so stream-based, this top picture is where a river is entering a big lake, and wetlands. It surprisingly is only less than 4% of the Montana landscape, but it actually is disproportionately important for our breeding birds. So even though it's just 4% of the landscape, we actually have more than 50% of our breeding birds that depend on that habitat. In Montana, we're talking about 433 birds that end up on our bird list, you'd say. Not easy to see all of them. I still haven't seen all of them in Montana yet, but about 250 of those do breed in the state. And then about 50% of those do rely on these types of habitats for successful nesting. What's really fun is most of the birds that do depend on these areas are some of our colorful and fun and very noisy birds. So this is the American redstart, one of my favorite birds up in the top corner. And then a warbling vireo, a little bit duller, and then the black-headed grosbeak. And what's fun is you'll see some pictures from birds that are very unique to Montana, but others you may recognize from home. And as I mentioned, this riparian habitat is disproportionately important, not only to breeding songbirds, but also a number of raptors. We have bald eagles, peregrines, prairie falcons, and osprey all nesting along river systems. And then our shorelines also provide great habitat for migrants. So you can see a bunch of American white pelicans loafing, in addition to shorebirds that end up using these habitats a little bit more sporadically. Moving on to our second focal habitat are the native grassland habitats. And if you spent any time looking at photos near Lewis and Clark Caverns, anywhere to the east, you'll notice that Montana definitely has a ton of native grassland habitats. And uniquely, one of the threats that's in this habitat more so than others is actually conversion to organic agriculture, because some of our grasslands are in such pristine condition, they're actually highly prized for not ever having pesticides on them, but so they are at risk for conversion. And our native grassland habitats make up about 35% of the state, but as you can see in these few photos, it becomes a little bit of shrubland habitat as well, and it's pretty hard to differentiate in some areas. As the northern plains have been chopped up by the plow primarily, Montana has become increasingly and relatively more valuable to grassland species. And again, these are grassland species that used to breed throughout the Midwest, or sorry, throughout the Great Plains, and even in some cases into the Midwest. And so just for the fun of it here, we have our Savannah Sparrow up in the top left, our sharp-tailed grouse, a McCown's longspur, our upland sandpiper, and the short-eared owl. So some real grassland specialists. A lot of folks don't think about owls nesting in the grasslands, but the short-eared owl actually will nest right there on the ground. So you need to have really intact grasslands for that to occur. So a really important state for grassland bird conservation, and you'll see some of that work a little later as well. The third primary habitat, and one that I hope you hear of from time to time from Montana, is our sagebrush habitat. And so the sage grouse especially has been a big topic of discussion for a number of years now. And with Montana's 35% of our habitat being sagebrush habitat, we actually are the state that has the second largest population of sage grouse in the West right now. So when you hear about sage grouse conservation, you can definitely think about Montana. And what's so interesting is that almost 70% of our sagebrush habitats are actually on a private landscape. So it's been so super important for Montana to have an intact and healthy sage grouse conservation plan, because so much of our landscape is privately owned, but is so important to the sage grouse. And a couple interesting pieces with sage grouse, and something that's fun to think of, is that they really are a species that's unique to North America. So it's not something that you can just go elsewhere and find it. The West is really where sage grouse are and where they're home and happy. And recently, we have to toot our horns for 1 second. Hopefully you've heard the news, but we have great news about a win for sage grouse that just this past Friday, judges have ruled against changes that were proposed for some Bureau of Land Management habitat management plans that would have negatively affected over 525 square miles of their habitat. And the reason this is important and very significant is because this has been one of the few times that Montana Audubon ever decided to get into a lawsuit to affect species conservation. We typically try to go through a very open public process where we're working together to meet a shared goal. But in this case, partners had worked together since probably 2013 to come up with plans that were adopted in 2015, statewide plans that were leveraged by a whole region of states having plans to conserve the sage grouse. And those plans were adopted by the Bureau of Land Management. However, in 2017, basically it was sort of turned on a dime and said, nope, we're going to get rid of these plans and open up a bunch of oil and gas leases. So both the National Audubon Society, Montana Wildlife Federation, and us, Montana Audubon, decided that we should enter a lawsuit. We should fight for this, because there's been a lot of time spent, a lot of individual organizations' energy spent, and we should do right for the bird. So the ruling did come out in our favor on Friday. So it is sort of a, hopefully hear a little golf clap around the room, but it's a huge win for sage grouse. And what's so great, we can talk about sage grouse forever, but when we talk about a win for sage grouse, there's another 350 other non-game species, which is what Montana Audubon focuses so much on, that do rely on sagebrush habitat as well. And so here's just a picture of a few of Montana's sagebrush specialists. One of my favorite being these awesome ferruginous hawks. Really a unique bird to the sagebrush prairies in Montana, and one that you find more abundantly in an area near the caverns than elsewhere in the state. And so it was easy to go on and focus on all the birds in Montana. So we do focus in specific habitats, but another way that we really focus our work is by focusing on which birds are species of concern. There's only so much time in the day, so only so many species you can choose to work on. In Montana, surprisingly, 66 are listed as species of concern. And this typically means it's in an active decline or it's in danger of decline. And what we typically find with these species is that it's a habitat-related issue. In particular, there are a lot of small ranches that are really dividing up grassland and sagebrush in Montana. And so just that fractioning of habitat is a huge threat to a number of species that need a large landscape. But as just another filter, the species of concern list is, it's one of the most important to the work that we do. And as we talk about some of these species, you'll see the little SOC in the corner highlighting that, in fact, this is a species of concern. We do take birds on and off of the list rather quickly because sometimes it's just to let us know that, hey, we need to learn a little bit more about this species. And maybe Montana is actually great habitat for that bird, but we just need to know a little bit more. One of the other reasons that Montana is so easy to get carried away about birds in is because of our location generally throughout the country. And I love to show people this slide because I think it's pretty surprising, but where Montana is, it actually overlaps two major migratory flyways for birds. And that's the Pacific Flyway and the Central Flyway. So you can see our little star there in the middle, and I'm not too far away in Helena, so our star overlaps as well, and we get a lot of great birds that are passing over this site. And it's so, I mean, a lot of them are going over at night, but it really ends up adding to a diversity of species that you can count at these sites. And hopefully you'll be surprised at the number of birds that really do end up being observed right at the Lewis and Clark Caverns. So here's a picture of some of different angles from the Caverns State Park itself. So you can see all the dry kind of grasslands grading into the shrubby uplands, and then a smattering of some pretty large trees that can be great magnets for some of our songbirds. And so this is the kind of mountain range that our migrants and songbirds will encounter right where those ranges overlap. And unfortunately, you aren't getting to explore the park right now on foot, sorry, but you will get to explore a little bit virtually as we go through the talk. And so now that you have a good idea about our focal habitats and sort of a little bit of the layout of what the park looks like itself, I am going to take a tangent to talk about birds and people and the value of observation and just how and why birds help us tell the story of conservation. So we are all about birds, but we are all about people. And the reason Montana Audubon is all about people is because we really need people to tell us where the birds are and tell us where the important species are, tell us what we might be missing, and to help catch all those different species that may be flying over from the Pacific or Central Flyways. And birders have a really long history of sharing these kind of observations and telling each other what's so super special about a place. And many people maybe have heard the term citizen science, or maybe the term is a little bit new to you, but definitely I would say air quotes birders are some of the folks that originally coined the term. And so as far as citizen observation goes, or citizen science, really the Christmas bird count of 1900 was sort of one of the first official documented instances of citizen science. The fun little tangent about this bird count in particular is that it actually evolved out of what was called the Christmas side hunt, and everyone actually would grab their rifles and go run out together and shoot all the birds, and then they would decide what they had found by looking at all the different carcasses. And so once binoculars became a bit more of the fad way to watch birds, they decided to have a Christmas bird count instead, where they could watch the birds with their binoculars rather than having to shoot them. So that's always an interesting tidbit. Some of the reasons that citizen science and observation are so important and valuable is that they just really give us a window into our natural world. And I like to say that Montana Audubon we're not a birding organization, even though we use birding to become advocates and to learn how to advocate and to learn what needs to be advocated for. But really it's about using that birding and that power of observation to affect conservation. And so hopefully we'll show you that observation is more than just noting a bird, but it really helps us answer some of the fundamental questions in ecology. And really what that comes down to is why species are where they are and when they're there. And so observation is the key to answering all of those questions. And so in this slide, you can just see a little bit of a laundry list of the questions that citizen observations can help us answer. So boom and bust populations, eruptive populations, that's something like these little finches down in the bottom that maybe track a massed crop of conifer seeds. So they're gonna be really abundant when the seeds are really abundant. Maybe tracking invasions. So invasions of locusts, that's actually one of the very, very oldest recorded data sets are locust eruptions. And tracking trends, so over time you end up with a great data set to show you how species are being affected by changes on the landscape. And then of course, one of the most fun is tracking migrations, watching the incredible distances that species can travel. The other great part about citizen science and the value of observation is that observation is important from everybody, and everybody really has the ability to contribute no matter their education level, where they live, what their interests are. And we can get carried away talking about different opportunities in citizen science, where some places have you looking at nebulas or cancerous cells. But really what's great is it can open the door to everybody getting involved in sharing their observations for some type of cause. Whoop, sorry. And one of the ways, Montana Audubon, we've tried to use our citizen science projects to really focus on certain bird species of concern. And you'll hear about 2 little projects coming up. But I just wanted to show you that it's become such a big part of our organization that we actually created an entire website, montanabirdsurveys.com, to help folks get involved. And what you can see on this screen here, it'll be at the bottom, but joining us for a Chimney Swift Night In, we're offering online volunteer survey trainings to make up for not being able to visit in person as well. So we've also been trying to change what we normally do as a group to an online training, and it's been pretty successful so far, and it's super exciting and fun to see folks that are willing to join us online. But please take time to explore that more if you want to see some of the individual projects that we do have. And I want to make sure to put another pitch in for one of the best ways to get started being a citizen scientist. And that is through ebird.org through Montana. /Montana. Hopefully a lot of people have heard about Montana eBird, and if not, just eBird itself. We've partnered with the Cornell Ornithological Institute to host a Montana portal to eBird. And what that means is when you go on to ebird/Montana, you'll actually get a Montana curated set of posts, and you can keep up to date with research that's going on in the state, by us, by the University of Montana, by Fish Wildlife Parks, and others that are working directly in Montana on bird conservation projects. So we're happy to help anyone connect with this resource for sure after the talk, but it's definitely been one of the most useful resources for researchers at the moment. One of the pieces of citizen science that can't be emphasized enough is that, of course, if we could, researchers could be everywhere for each species, we would, but it really takes quite a large effort to survey most species, especially in our large state, and citizen scientists really, gosh, they make it such an easier to access, and we can cover a lot more ground. Whoops. And so with that, I want to just jump back to our montanabirdsurveys.com, because what's super fun in our citizen science programs that we don't normally have is a way that you can support not only with your bird observations, but if you're interested in purchasing a really cool shirt, we had an artist, Brian Busby, a fellow Swift surveyor, help us design t-shirts for our Black Swift surveys that are taking place this summer. That's a whole other talk in and of itself that we get really excited about. You'll hear about another really cool Swift, but just another way to encourage you all to check out our site and see what we have to offer for citizen science. And also both Carmen and myself are happy to answer any questions about citizen science. And so jumping back into the fun part that you've all been waiting for is a little more, of course, about the birds. And so using eBird/Montana was one of the first ways that we were trying to figure out which birds do we want to talk about, highlight, and share with you about this park. Again, there's so many species in Montana. How do you figure out which ones to look at? Well, what we did was we used eBird/Montana to figure out just which species were where. And Emily, I think now I'll help you or have you transition over to Carmen, and I can try and perhaps answer a question or two on the way.
Fantastic. Before I switch over to Carmen, just a quick announcement. We actually are open for business right now. The park gates to the road leading up to the Cave Visitor Center are currently open Friday through Monday for limited cave tours. We're only taking 9 tours a day with only 9 people on them. So it's by reservation only, but the park is open. Most of the trails are open for biking and hiking. So please do come to the park if you get the chance. We would love to see you there. And now I'll transition over to Carmen.
Perfect. Let's see. Amy, if you would like to stop screen sharing.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Carmen Borscheltz. I'm the Big Sky Watershed Corps member serving with Montana Audubon this year. I actually used to work at the Caverns the last 2 summers in 2019 and 2018, so I'm very excited to be able to combine birds and what the Caverns has to offer just outside of the cave, because as Emily mentioned, there are trails, there's biking, so there's a lot of the park that it has to offer other than just the cave. But I will go ahead and start screen sharing. Awesome. So where Amy left off on talking about eBird and how we were able to find out what birds are actually in the park is through these checklists that are submitted. So some of you may know how to use this platform, but for those of you who don't, you can actually search specific locations all around Montana. And you can actually see the checklists that have been submitted, as well as the birds they saw within those checklists. So that is how today we were able to find out what birds are within the park. And you can see here on the right side of the screen, all the birds listed. And it's actually pretty great because the guy who submitted it, Tom Forwood, is actually the assistant park manager He's a huge birder, very knowledgeable, and occasionally he does do birding tours throughout the summer, so be sure to pay attention to that. They may be posting it on their Facebook page. Currently, I don't think there's anything planned due to all of COVID and whatnot, but keep your fingers crossed, something may happen later in the summer. Now, let's see here. As Amy also mentioned, Lewis and Clark Caverns is right along the migratory flyway of the Central and Pacific Flyway, and Montana is right in the center of that. So the caverns actually gets quite a fair number of unique species that come through from time to time. Some of those would be such as the American avocet, the veery, tundra swans, some snow geese, the American widgeon, but also take note that there are songbirds that tend to fly over during the nighttime that you don't necessarily get to see or they aren't observed, but they do fly over and go through the park. Now, as you can see, some of these water birds here, we'll kind of start with the riparian area of Lewis and Clark Caverns. So as most of you probably know, the Jefferson River runs right through that valley there. And one bird you may be able to see is the great blue heron. From time to time, they do come through that valley, but it is one species that we wanted to highlight because it is also a species of concern. They have been on a 2.2% decline for numerous years now, and Montana Audubon has actually put together a brand new rookery survey where you can also become a citizen scientist and go out and survey heron rookeries so that we can get a better count on our heron population. Now, they necessarily aren't nesting within the valley of where Lewis and Clark Caverns lies, but they are on both valleys surrounding the park. So they are around. And you can tend to find them in marshes, shores, foraging, in calm water, or slow-moving rivers. They will travel anywhere from up to 5 to 10 miles to forage. And you can actually, they nest in old-growth cottonwoods, anywhere from 1 to 20 nests, many, many more nests than that sometimes if they're huge heron rookeries. But we'll actually take a listen to what their call is like. So our sound button isn't working. So if Amy, you would like to, perfect. Oh, it's like going in and out. Yeah, we were having, there you go. Perfect, that's great. Yeah, we had a sound issue. We have this little sound bubble right here, but it for some reason wasn't working. So we're cheating and Amy's using her phone to do the sounds. But you can actually see all these green little squares on the screen are actually all known heron rookery locations. We currently have about 25 volunteers out in the field going out to survey 40 different locations, which is really exciting. And there are numerous locations still available to go and survey. So you can email me. My email's at the very end. But very exciting and an all new project that this year that we just started. But going back to the park, one chatty bird that you can see kind of in the riparian area is the beautiful Bullock's Oriole. Now you can tend to find them in open forest or on the edges of forests, in leafy shrubs. I found their nest very interesting as always. It's actually like a hanging pouch right here on the bottom left, made from plant fibers, strips of bark, grass, yarn, so on and so forth, whatever material they can grab pretty much to make their beautiful nests. And we'll actually take a quick little listen to them as well. Perfect. It's very quiet, but it works. So that's what you gotta listen for in the park when you're walking along the trails. Another chatty bird that you'll possibly run into is the gray catbird. You'll more or less hear them before you see them, and it's called the catbird because yes, it does sound like a cat. Now you can tend to find them in undergrowth, brush, thorn shrubs. It does favor dense, low growth. Most common in leafy thickets on the edge of woods or streams. And so we'll actually take a quick listen to them because you can't not listen to their meows. All right, perfect. As always, such a cute song they have. And now another chatty bird, it even has chat in the name, is why it's so chatty, is the yellow-breasted chat. Now you can tend to find them in stream thickets. They do breed in dense shrubbery. Most of the time along the river as well. And we'll go ahead and take a quick little listen to them as well. Awesome. And so another bird that you'll find along the Jefferson River is the American white pelican. Now, most Montanans are actually pretty surprised when they realize that American white pelicans do breed in Montana. There are actually 6 known locations throughout Montana, and there are about between 4,000 to 6,000 nests a year in Montana alone. Pretty insane. The closest nesting area to Lewis and Clark Caverns is just north of the caverns at Canyon Ferry, where they tend to have about 2,500 nests a year. Pretty crazy. You can imagine how smelly that gets. But within the Lewis and Clark Caverns Park, you can see them flying and foraging along the Jefferson River. Now moving a little, we'll take a little quick listen to them. Always lovely to hear them. So moving a little more upland is going to talk about the grassland birds that you can find within the park. So this will be kind of around the campground area, the main visitor center, right where you drive into the park. One bird that you may be able to see from time to time, there's actually been only 1 or 2 reports of this, is the long-billed curlew. We also wanted to highlight this because they also are a species of concern in Montana, just due to the decline in numbers and loss of the Great Plains. But let's see here. They tend to nest in the Great Plains and sometimes rangeland that's not too heavily grazed. But we'll actually take a listen to their awesome call as well. Awesome. And so the name, or their scientific name, Numenius americanus, is actually thought to come from the Greek words for new moon because of the thin crescent shape of the silver moon and kind of how the shape of the bill is, which is very interesting. And Amy also alluded to this earlier at the very beginning of the talk, how we went to Phillips County last week. Just south of Malta, we were actually doing long-billed curlew surveys. Now we were with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and American Prairie Reserve. They are wanting to conduct research into keystone species, effects on biodiversity in the grassland ecosystems. They want to understand how the long-billed curlew move and select habitat relative to the presence of the keystone species, the black-tailed prairie dog. They also want to be able to describe the movement patterns and test hypotheses about species interactions. While we were there, we were nest searching for them, and then we had to capture them, and we had to GPS tag the long-billed curlew. And we can actually see here at the very top left picture, their little backpack. That is the GPS tracker that we put on them. And if you ever wanted to know how to weigh a curlew, you put them in a little burrito wrap, very cute. And then after you do putting on the backpack, you band them with their leg bands. You want to be sure that they can fly safely and that they didn't get hurt or anything in the process. So we put them in a tent just to test out their legs. So on the very right, we have a camping curlew, pretty awesome. And always never a bad reason to show off a little baby curlew picture. And we actually have a picture of what a curlew nest looks like. And you can see just how camouflaged they are and how well they blend into the landscape. And even just by looking at the pattern of the long-billed curlew, they also blend very well into the landscape. So they are very hard to find. But of course, we can't do a PowerPoint presentation without mentioning the western meadowlark, the Montana state bird. So you can actually find them in grasslands, cultivated fields, pastures, meadows, prairies, probably in the campground, at the main visitor center, that whole area. And let's see, let's also take a quick listen to them.
Zoom. Sky is spectacular tonight.
Okay.
Where? All around. It's like a painting.
All right, perfect. And just a friendly reminder to have yourself on mute. And so also one that you can find in grasslands is the Lark Sparrow. You can find them in the same kind of habitat as the western meadowlark, in open country, brushes, trees, pastures, farms, on roadsides. And if you're wondering what a lark sparrow nest looks like, on the bottom left picture, very cute. And we'll also take a quick listen to what they sound like. Perfect. So another grassland bird that you'll most likely hear in the visitor center area, campground area, is the Savannah Sparrow. They also like the exact same habitat. And we can see on the bottom right picture, the little nestlings that have hatched, very cute. And we'll also take a quick listen to them. Perfect. They sound like an insect, which is very interesting. So, moving a little upwards to the cave entrance or the upper visitor center portion of the park, or if you're hiking in the higher elevation trails, these are some birds that you can listen to along the trails. The first bird would be the green-tailed towhee. Now, they tend to like brushy mountain slopes, open pines. They favor dense, low coverage of sagebrush, which is actually the perfect habitat for the upper portion of the park. And we'll take a quick listen to them as well. Perfect. And so another one that you'll most likely be able to hear as you're walking up to the cave entrance or you're walking out of the cave would be the rock wren. Now they tend to like habitats such as rocky slopes, canyons. You can find them at low elevations, all the way up to the high mountaintops. They do prefer to be in open, arid landscapes. And we can also see a nest right here on the right, and we will take a quick little listen to them as well. All right, great. So one of the last final birds that you can observe in the upper portion, higher elevation of the park would be the Lazuli Bunting. Sorry if I said that wrong. I apparently can't say my Z's. But they tend to like open brush in pinyon juniper woods, which is actually all along the higher elevation of the park. So that is a perfect area to observe them. And we will take a quick listen to them as well. All right. Kind of hard to hear. Sorry, guys. A little technical
I can
difficulties.
try again. Let me try again. I might have had it aimed badly.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy.
Mhm.
So one final bird that you can possibly see on the upper elevations of the park is the white-throated swift. Now they tend to, you can find them in the open skies, cruising widely looking for insects. They tend to nest in cliff crevices, in dry mountains. Nesting details about this bird are actually poorly known just due to inaccessibility. We can actually see an example of a little crevice right here that there's a nest in, and as you can imagine, they're very hard to find. And we will take a listen to them as well. Very chatty birds. But as always, your observations are always valuable, no matter where you are birding. And there's also way more exciting things to do all around Lewis and Clark Caverns Park, as well as the cave. As mentioned, there's trails which you can go birding on anytime. So we will open it up now to some questions. Are there any questions?
Well, I'll jump in. Hopefully folks can hear about for tips for things to do at different houses for birds. And depending on what type of habitat you live on, one of the first answers I think is always trying to keep cats away. I know we have, even in downtown Helena, there's probably 4 or so stray cats, which is definitely a big problem. But if you do have feeders, also keeping them away from big windows can be good. Windows where they can see habitat through them is really, it's nice to have feeders away from that type of scenario. But another great thing is just really encouraging shrub cover at your house. And even, I think what's so cool about places like Lewis and Clark Caverns that can be so arid, but during migration they have enough trees that they can be a little temporary magnet for birds. And houses definitely can be like that during migration. Yeah, definitely with understory, nearby stream habitat for sure. It's nice to make sure you have a variety of layers of trees, so different ages of trees, and that way there's a lot of connectivity between the habitat itself. One thing we see in some cottonwood forests is where there's maybe no rose or willow understory, we'll have less birds. And in Montana and some other states in the West for sure, keeping Russian olive out of riparian areas can be really important. They outcompete a lot of native trees pretty well. And surprisingly, they don't form cavities, which isn't something we mentioned, but a lot of our riparian birds do rely on cavities for nests. Is this the Russian olive tree? Perhaps. Let's see. I like the general feeder question is always a good question about bird feeders helping or harming birds. And I think there's sort of a number of ways to approach it. And I think generally what you could say is that when you choose to feed birds, you're not typically providing like a make or break situation where if you don't provide that food, they won't be able to find it elsewhere. Because fortunately in Montana, we do have such a great amount of good habitat that typically you're not sort of dooming birds to a bad fate if you don't feed them. But then the next layer I would say is when you do choose to feed birds, probably the most important thing is just making sure you keep all of the feeding areas clean, and again, kind of away from windows that they could hit or away from where cats or other predators could access them. I know it can be sort of a good thing or a bad thing occasionally when folks are feeding birds, and it occasionally will invite predator birds. So you'll occasionally have other hawks that start showing up to feed on your feeder because they've learned that it's a good source of food. So in that case, sometimes I've encouraged people to make sure you move the feeders often so that predators don't get habituated to them. You might have to take them down for a little while if you do have a predator that starts keying in on them. But for the most part, I think it's a really great activity, and I think mostly it's a really great way to interact with birds and have them be a part of your landscape and your house. And it's certainly for a lot of the migrants providing some helpful fuel for sure. And then the other piece of it I'd just say is just being really careful to pay attention to bear regulations depending on where your feeders are, because certainly before birds go into hibernation, or if they come out early and there are feeders accessible, they become quite a bear, I would say, to take care of. So in the summer, that's usually a big issue, just making sure they're not accessible to bears. And then
a recommended book would be the Sibley's Guide. Actually, have it right here.
Oh,
this
great.
one, Silly Birds for the West. You can use that. Very helpful, very informative. Or there's actually a National Geographic one that's very good as well.
And those birds, I was using to play actually the Sibley app as well. I'll put that in the chat. And that was really neat because you can then have a set of bird recordings in your pocket as well. And there are some apps out there that can help you kind of figure out what birds you're looking at as well. They may divide them by color or habitat and things like that.
Amy, anything about hummingbirds?
Yeah, I can give a couple general things, and I'll use it at tangent too on the other swift question. One of the best ways to look for or find swifts is to listen for that chattering call. And I always try to tell people is if you hear that chatter, just try to train yourself to look up, because it's a bird that you're probably just going to see the silhouette of it going really quickly. But I'll segue that into the hummingbirds, because actually swifts and hummingbirds are in the same family, which is surprising but very cool. And you can tell that they're both such talented flyers. But Montana, we don't have a great diversity of hummingbirds, but one of them, the black-chinned hummingbird, is one that I've seen more in that sort of brushy, arid habitat near the park than in other places. So we will typically get black-chinned hummingbirds, calliope hummingbirds, and then the Allen's hummingbird and rufous. So we don't have a huge smattering. Definitely people that have feeders are much more likely to catch a glimpse of them as a few of them move through on migration. But I think the calliope is fun because it's one of the smaller in North America with a super bright throat, and that's probably our most common when you're near riparian areas and you have willows and all of that. I would say hummingbird feeders are the best way, though, to kind of cheat a little bit. It's okay. See any other questions?
Any final questions?
Feel free to follow up with us. Thank you, everybody.